As you know, working with Dr. Nelson in preparing worship, nothing is accidental. Every detail is planned. It struck me as I came up to announce that I was preaching the final part of this 9-week series on Colossians that he chose to lead in with, "Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise." Didn't know that's how we felt about it. You are, let me announce with great pride, you are now the most currently informed church on the planet on the book of Colossians. That doesn't mean you're the most well-informed church on the planet, but you are the most currently informed. In fact, you might feel like the story I read this week in a book from 1936 about an old farmer who had just heard a long series on the book of Colossians. And at the end of the series, the old farmer said, "The Colossians must have been very clever folk. If, as we're told, the epistle was just a letter written to be read to them, I suppose they would understand it when they heard, while we have been 3 months at it and I don't understand it yet." That might be your experience. But we have come to the final verses, the conclusion. And this last section has been given lots of scholarly attention because it seems like such an abrupt change of tone and topic, some suggesting that it was inserted later. In fact, one scholar suggests that it has so little to do with the core subject matter that, as he put it, it's a bag of answers to meet recurring problems and questions common to the members of different early Christian communities. So some think it didn't belong in here at all, just kind of got stuck in later. But I prefer to think of it as the logical progression of the last 2 weeks. Here's what I mean. You remember that in the first chapters, the opening chapters, Paul makes these grand theological claims about the centrality of Christ. Then Paul answers the Gnostics and the angel worshipers. But then the focus shifted to behavior. 2 weeks ago, the attention was on our most intimate and private behaviors. Last week, we heard Paul say that the Christian life should expand into the home, those closest to you. And so this seems logical that the circle would widen a bit more. The discussion of mutual friends, of outsiders, brethren at nearby churches, it seems to be a natural next step, answering the question, how should the Christian life impact relationships beyond the home? Well, the Gnostics were so consumed with their little clique of super Christians that they didn't think much about how to be witnesses to the gospel beyond themselves. You see, Gnosticism narrows the focus of life. Everything gets concerned with what the cool kids are doing. It's about our behavior. It's about what happens inside our little club. And we know some descendants of that tradition. There are some stringent Christian communities today that stay in a frenzy about protecting their little Christian bubble so that no impure influence penetrates. But Paul is telling us, I think, that the Christian gospel should widen our angle of vision, and that through prayer and gracious behavior and winsome speech, we should think about how to offer this good gift of God to the others around us. There's a lot about this that strikes me as amazing. First of all, that Paul has this broad worldview while he's stuck in a stone prison and writing with the delight of somebody whose life is just full of relationship and joy. Tychicus will tell you about my affairs. Onesimus, the faithful and beloved brother. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, if he comes, greet him, receive him. In the catch of a dreary prison cell, there's still a sense that he's surrounded by community and a community that he's commending to others. And I confess that my tendency is just the opposite. Unlike the imprisoned Paul, I am surrounded by people. I work in a beehive of smart, interesting people. My best friends in the world live in the city. I could call them for lunch almost any time. The others I could easily call on the way home. And yet too often I build my own prison. Like the Gnostics, I become so consumed with my people and my problems and my little world that I draw a small circle and cut myself off from life-giving relationships. And Paul talks about how to relate to the outsider, those who are not Christians. I will go weeks and not see an outsider. I stay on the phone and stay in meetings with you, insiders. I play with the same toys in the same sandbox with the same friends all the time. And when I lose my edge, when my world gets small, I stop inviting people into my sandbox. And I stay home and heat up a lean cuisine and check Facebook to see what my friends are eating for dinner and whether or not they like the grilled snapper, and tell myself I'm staying connected to them in some way. Not to mention that Paul is pushing us into a world where people are so busy spending and earning and building and consuming and going and spending and getting the door and nodding to people in the elevator and never touching one another. And we go home to the pain of another day void of meaning, another day void of touch, another day filled with people I did not see, and another day of crowds and nobody saw me. And the world is so hungry for the authentic promise of the gospel. The scores of people we pass and nod with are hungry for meaning and belonging and the abundance of the Christian life, and Paul is pushing us to take this Christian life into the world beyond church and home. And his advice about how to do it is so simple. It doesn't require the purchase of any DVDs or tracts. I mean, the Christian community and the booksellers have made this into a complicated training. But Paul tells us how to relate to the world beyond our Christian bubble. And it's not terribly complicated. It's difficult. It's just not complicated. Here's what he says. Continue steadfastly in prayer. Conduct yourself wisely toward outsiders, making the most of your time. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. So the first step, loosely translated, to being a gospel witness to the larger community is to not be a jerk, right? I mean, make friends with people. He says, pray. Make the most of your time. In other words, when you're with somebody, be fully present with them. Be gracious. Be the person other folks want to sit with at lunch. And know how you ought to answer. That is, when the matter of faith or meaning or church or purpose or fullness or delight comes into the conversation, know how to answer with a gracious word that bears witness to the truth. As Anne Lamott says, you don't always have to chop with the sword of truth. You can use it to point with, too. So Paul's advice to dealing with the non-Christian world is this simple and this difficult. Be gracious. I heard Fred Craddock, the now retired preacher professor from Emory University, say one time that he thought the final work of grace in a person's life is to make him or her gracious. perhaps that's true. Have you ever thought about whether or not people would describe you as gracious? Have you ever given any thought to whether or not you are the person people want to sit next to at lunch? I have a pastor friend who actually divides the world that way. There are two groups of people in her life, the people who give her energy and the people who drain her energy. And she puts little notations in her calendar. And she won't have more than 3 meetings a week with people who drain her energy and just fill up her week with the others. It's a way of taking care of herself. She's going to be with people who bring life and vitality and minimize her time with the drains. I'd tell you how that's working for her. I just can't seem to get on her lunch schedule. I'll get back to you on that. I don't know. Conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders, making the most of your time. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. An early writing, The Apocalypse of Shadrach, says that no respectable person, if they were hosting, would serve a meal that didn't have salt. So apparently, in the ancient world, there was an association with salt and enjoyment. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt. Now, this sermon might start sounding like a Hallmark card, but let me assure you it's not. Let me assure you that what I'm talking about is muscular work, which is why Paul begins with prayer. Because if you turn loose wisdom and gracious speech, if you let that lead, you'll begin to widen your circle and you'll look for ways to include people in your graciousness, and after a while, it will start to look radical, not pastel and nice. Because being gracious has the power to transform relationships. Let me illustrate from just a few of the names Paul mentions here in the letter. Onesimus, you recognize that name. A slave, he's mentioned in the book Philemon, right? A slave, and yet here, not called a slave at all, faithful and beloved brother. So the relationship has been transformed. Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, you might recall from the book of Acts. You might remember that he and Paul had a relational spat in Acts, and he quit on Paul once, and Paul's response was to refuse to take him on another journey. The two of them never worked together again. And yet here he says to the Colossians, if Mark comes to you, receive him. The relationship is transformed. Or Paul mentioned that only a few of his fellow workers were men of the circumcision, so that the Gentile group was a growing part of his inner circle. Gentiles who were racial outsiders, Paul is now including in his circle of care. So the relationships are transformed. He mentions Nympha, who's a leader of a church in her home. And in the first century, you know the position of women in the first century, marginalized at best, and now she is greeted in this list from the great apostle. Relationships transformed. Who is the hardest person for you to be gracious toward? You ever thought about that? It might be somebody from this list. It could be a slave now free, that is, somebody not in your social standing. It could be Mark, that is, someone you have had a falling out with. It might be the uncircumcised, that is, somebody of a different ethnic background. Or it could be Nympha, someone the Christian community has generally looked down on. You see, being gracious is not the soft work of a Hallmark card. It is the hard, gritty, generous, loving response to having been set free. Continue steadfastly in prayer. Conduct yourself wisely toward outsiders, making the most of your time. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. You have been set free. By the power of the gospel, you have experienced forgiveness and purpose and genuine community. And some of you have been in church so long, you don't remember what it's like to be an outsider. You were an insider all your life. But that's not true of everyone. Some of you remember what it was like to be an outsider, and you drove by churches and wondered what kind of hocus pocus goes on in there. You remember wondering if anybody would welcome you if you walked in. If you came into one of those churches, would they look at you funny or include you? You remember the tug when you drove by, believing at some level that the answer to life might be found in the message they preached behind the stained glass window, but you were afraid to come in because you didn't know how you'd be received. You remember what it felt like to be afraid nobody would ever invite you to church, or afraid somebody might invite you to church. The stories are all different. Your stories are varied. But I'm betting there is one common experience in every story, that what got you here and what kept you here is that you ran into somebody who was gracious. Maybe Fred Craddock was right. The final act of grace in a person's life is to make him or her gracious.